When criminals threatened a quiet farming town, they thought the old man living alone would be an easy target. But they never imagined this simple farmer was actually a legendary CIA operative who had turned his entire property into an elaborate trap, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that the hunter had become the hunted. The setting sun cast long shadows across the weathered barn as 3 black SUVs kicked up dust along the dirt road leading to Old Man Harrison's farm. The vehicle's engines growled menacingly in the peaceful countryside silence, disturbing a flock of crows that took flight from nearby fence posts. Inside the barn, Harrison methodically arranged his tools, each one in its precise place, when he heard the vehicles approaching. His weathered hands paused briefly over a wrench, but he didn't turn around. Not yet. Well, what do we have here? A voice dripping with mock friendliness carried across the yard. Boot steps crunched on gravel as 5 men approached the barn's entrance. Their leader, a tall figure in an expensive leather jacket, pulled out a cigarette and lit it with theatrical slowness. Harrison remained focused on his workbench, his shoulders slightly tensed, a detail so subtle it would go unnoticed by most observers. The evening breeze carried the scent of tobacco and expensive cologne into the barn. "You know, old-timer," the man in the leather jacket drawled, "most folks around here know better than to ignore visitors." He flicked his half-smoked cigarette, still burning, onto a pile of hay near the barn's entrance. The dry stalks began to smoke ominously. Harrison's eyes flickered to the smoldering hay, then to the shadow-cast figures at his barn door. His fingers closed around the wrench he'd been holding, but he set it down with deliberate care. "I hear you're sitting on quite a bit of land here," the leader continued, his boots echoing on the wooden floor as he stepped inside. "And living all alone must be hard to maintain such a large property by yourself." The other men spread out, their predatory movements betraying their intentions. They saw what they wanted to see: an aging farmer, alone and vulnerable, an easy target on an isolated property far from any help. But they missed the details, the too precise arrangement of tools, the way Harrison's eyes cataloged each man's position without seeming to move, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance that spoke of something far different from fear. As the last rays of sunlight retreated from the barn's entrance, none of the intruders noticed the slight smile that crossed Harrison's face. They had no idea what they'd just walked into. 20 years earlier, the man now known as Harrison stood in a dimly lit room in Langley, Virginia, his CIA badge reflecting the fluorescent lights as he placed it on his superior's desk. The memory flickered through his mind as he faced the intruders in his barn, a ghost from a past life he'd tried to leave behind. "Agent James Morrison," his handler had said that day, "your service record speaks for itself." The words echoed in his thoughts as he assessed the 5 men before him, automatically noting their weak points, stance variations, and concealed weapons, habits that 2 decades of retirement hadn't erased. His mind drifted to Bogota, 1998. The rain had been relentless as he orchestrated the extraction of 3 high-value assets from a cartel stronghold. Then to Moscow, 2003, where he'd spent 3 months deep undercover, gathering intelligence that would prevent a terrorist attack on European soil. Each mission had added layers to his training, honing instincts that never truly disappeared. The retirement to this farm hadn't been entirely his choice. After the Beijing incident in 2005, an operation that remained heavily redacted in agency files, he'd recognized the toll his work had taken. The decision to disappear into rural America came naturally, though the agency had helped arrange his new identity. Harrison's eyes darted to the far corner of the barn, where beneath innocent-looking hay bales lay a hidden compartment. Inside, a cache of equipment remained ready: communication devices, weapons, and documents he hoped never to need again. Old habits die hard, and preparation had kept him alive through 20 years of service. His daily routine on the farm reflected his training, though few would notice. The methodical way he surveyed his property each morning, walking the perimeter with what appeared to be a farmer's casual gaze but was, in fact, a security check. The strategic placement of mirrors in his house and barn, offering clear sightlines to all approaches. The careful maintenance of escape routes disguised as ordinary farm paths. Even now, as he stood at his workbench, his posture revealed nothing of his capabilities. His shoulders remained relaxed, his breathing steady. To the untrained eye, he appeared to be exactly what he seemed: an aging farmer, perhaps a bit too neat with his tools, but otherwise unremarkable. The leader of the group took another step forward, and Harrison's mind automatically calculated the distance between them, mapped potential movement paths, and identified at least 7 ways to neutralize the threat without drawing the weapon concealed beneath his workbench. These instincts, this constant awareness, had become as natural as breathing. Even in retirement, he maintained his physical condition through what appeared to be ordinary farm work, lifting hay bales, repairing fences, chopping wood. Each task doubled his training, keeping his strength and agility sharp without drawing attention. The last rays of sunlight disappeared completely, leaving the barn in growing darkness. Harrison knew every inch of this space, had memorized the location of every tool, every obstacle. In the encroaching shadows, his years of night operation training would give him a decisive advantage if needed. As the intruders moved deeper into his barn, Harrison remained still, his farmer's calloused hands betraying nothing of the specialized combat training they'd received. He'd spent years cultivating this persona, the quiet, solitary farmer who kept to himself. It had become a comfortable role, but beneath it, Agent Morrison remained vigilant, ready. The leader's cigarette smoke drifted through the air, and Harrison's mind flashed to another smoke-filled room in Baghdad, 2001. Different circumstances, same underlying tension. He pushed the memory aside, focusing on the present threat. Whatever these men intended, they'd chosen the wrong farm to target. Life in Miller's Creek had a predictable rhythm that Harrison had come to appreciate. Every morning at precisely 6 a.m., he would emerge from his farmhouse, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, to watch the sun rise over his cornfields. The routine wasn't just habit, it provided an excellent vantage point to observe any overnight disturbances on his property. From his front porch, he could see the Thompson farm to the east, where old Bill Thompson's cows grazed lazily in the morning mist. Bill was a decent neighbor, though his curious nature had led to some uncomfortable questions over the years. "You sure handle that tractor like a man who's done more than farming," Bill had once remarked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Harrison had deflected with a story about his fictional uncle's farm in Nebraska. The small town of Miller's Creek lay 5 miles south, population 2,347, according to the faded welcome sign. Harrison made his weekly trips there every Thursday, timing his visits to coincide with the local farmers market. It wasn't just about maintaining appearances. The market provided an excellent opportunity to gather intelligence about local happenings, while appearing to simply make small talk. Sarah at the general store always had the latest town gossip, though Harrison was more interested in her occasional mentions of strange vehicles passing through town or unfamiliar faces asking questions. Martha at the post office would chat about mail routes and delivery schedules, information that could prove vital if he ever needed to track movement patterns in the area. Recently, the conversations had taken a darker turn. Jenny's hardware store had been broken into last month, its safe cleaned out with surprising precision. The local sheriff called it professional work, but Harrison recognized the telltale signs of something more organized taking root in the community. The diner on Main Street, usually filled with the cheerful chatter of locals, had grown quieter lately. People spoke in hushed tones about missing livestock, damaged property, and threatening notes left for business owners who refused to pay for protection. The sheriff's department, understaffed and underfunded, seemed overwhelmed by the sudden surge in criminal activity. Harrison's nearest neighbor, Grace Chen, a retired school teacher who lived half a mile down the road, had started keeping her doors locked, a first in her 30 years of residence. She confided in Harrison last week about strange noises at night and missing items from her garden shed. "There's something different about you," she'd said, studying his face. "You're not scared like the others." The local diner's owner, Mike Rodriguez, had begun closing early after receiving threatening phone calls. Harrison would sometimes catch Mike watching him with an odd expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You carry yourself different," Mike had mentioned once while serving Harrison his usual black coffee. "Military?" "Just good posture," Harrison had replied with a slight smile, but he'd made a mental note to adjust his bearing in public. The changes in Miller's Creek weren't subtle to someone with Harrison's training. New faces at the bar on the edge of town, expensive cars with out-of-state plates parked behind the abandoned mill, hushed conversations that stopped when locals walked by, all signs of an organized criminal element moving in, testing the waters, looking for weak points in the community. The town's vulnerability made strategic sense. Located 3 hours from the nearest major city, with a small police force and multiple access routes through backcountry roads, Miller's Creek was an ideal location for criminal operations. The recent closure of the lumber mill had left many young people unemployed and potentially susceptible to recruitment. Harrison watched it all unfold with growing concern, maintaining his cover while gathering information. He kept detailed mental notes of suspicious activities, patterns of movement, and potential threats. His weekly drives into town became careful reconnaissance missions disguised as ordinary errands. Now, as he faced the intruders in his barn, he understood that Miller's Creek's problems had finally reached his doorstep. The peaceful facade of his retirement was about to be tested, and the quiet farmer persona he'd cultivated would soon face its greatest challenge. The first signs of trouble had appeared 3 months ago, when the Wilkinson family's store reported missing inventory. Not a typical smash and grab, but a calculated operation that bypassed the security system and left no traces except for a small business card with a black scorpion printed on it. Harrison had noticed the shift in town dynamics immediately. The casual friendliness that characterized Miller's Creek began to fade, replaced by darting glances and hushed conversations. Within weeks, 3 more businesses received similar cards, accompanied by demands for protection money. From his vantage point at Mike's Diner, Harrison observed the newcomers who'd begun frequenting the town. They arrived in expensive vehicles with tinted windows, wearing clothes that cost more than most locals made in a month. Their movements were coordinated, their presence deliberately intimidating. He recognized the tactics. He'd seen similar operations in dozens of countries during his CIA years. The gang's hierarchy became clear through careful observation. Lower-level members handled the initial intimidation, while more sophisticated operators managed the money collection. Harrison had counted 12 different individuals so far, but suspected the organization was larger. One morning, he'd watched from behind his newspaper as they cornered Tommy Chen, Grace's nephew, behind the pharmacy. The boy emerged, shaken but unharmed, carrying a message for his aunt about her property being perfect for storage purposes. Harrison had memorized the faces of the 3 men involved, noting their vehicle's license plate and the way they favored their right sides, indicating concealed weapons. The local sheriff, Dave Matthews, seemed helpless against the rising tide. "Just keep your doors locked and report any suspicious activity," he'd advised at a town meeting. Harrison had sat in the back, watching the fear spread through the room like a virus. He recognized the calculated escalation of violence, small enough to avoid federal attention, but significant enough to break the community's will. Last week, the feed store had burned down after its owner, Jim Parker, refused to pay. The fire department called it an accident, but Harrison had examined the scene afterward, identifying the sophisticated accelerant used. It was professional work, meant to send a message. The gang's territory expanded methodically. They started in town, then moved to the outskirts, targeting isolated properties. Harrison tracked their pattern, noting how they worked in expanding circles, systematically covering ground. His farm, he realized, would eventually fall within their scope. Yesterday, he'd spotted their vehicles conducting reconnaissance of his property. They'd tried to be subtle, driving past at irregular intervals, but Harrison's trained eye caught their systematic approach. They were mapping his routine, looking for vulnerabilities. Through his network of casual conversations, Martha at the post office, Mike at the diner, even old Bill Thompson, Harrison pieced together the larger picture. The gang was establishing a corridor for their operations, using Miller's Creek's strategic location and minimal law enforcement presence to their advantage. The local teenagers had started disappearing for hours at a time, returning with unexplained cash. Harrison recognized the recruitment strategy: start with the young and vulnerable, build a local network, establish deep roots in the community. He'd seen it work in dozens of small towns across South America and Eastern Europe. When the black SUVs finally turned onto his property today, Harrison was ready. He'd observed their escalating pattern of violence, their preference for targeting those they perceived as weak or isolated. His carefully cultivated image as a solitary old farmer had drawn their attention, exactly as he'd anticipated. The gang's confidence had grown with each successful intimidation. They'd never faced serious resistance in Miller's Creek, leading them to become complacent. It was a common mistake Harrison had seen countless times during his career, underestimating a target based on appearances. Now, as the intruders spread through his barn, Harrison could see they followed the same pattern he'd observed in town. The leader, showing off his authority with the casual flick of a cigarette. The enforcers, positioning themselves to intimidate. They expected fear, compliance, perhaps some token resistance at most. What they didn't expect was the calm stillness with which Harrison stood his ground. They couldn't know that their every movement was being assessed, categorized, and countered in his mind, drawing upon decades of experience they couldn't begin to imagine. "Last chance, old man," the leader said, crushing his cigarette beneath an expensive boot. "We can do this the easy way." His men had positioned themselves strategically around the barn, or at least what they thought was strategic. Harrison noted their amateur mistakes. Two had backed themselves into corners with limited escape routes. Another stood directly in front of a hanging lamp that silhouetted him perfectly. The fourth man's nervous finger tapping against his concealed weapon betrayed his inexperience. "I'm just a farmer," Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying the slow, measured cadence he'd cultivated over years of rural life. "Don't have much worth taking." His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his weight had imperceptibly shifted to the balls of his feet. The leader laughed, the sound echoing off the barn's wooden walls. "See, that's where you're wrong. This property, its location, its isolation, it has tremendous potential." He stepped closer, invading Harrison's personal space. "We're offering you a partnership of sorts." Harrison allowed a flicker of confusion to cross his face, playing his role perfectly. "Partnership? Your barn would make an excellent storage facility. Your remote location, the multiple access roads." The leader gestured expansively. "We're willing to compensate you, of course. Consider it a rental agreement." A sudden breeze through the barn door made the hanging tools sway slightly. Harrison tracked the movement of each shadow, every shifting piece of equipment. The declining sunlight had created deep pockets of darkness in the corners. Tactical advantages he'd incorporated into the barn's design years ago. "And if I decline?" Harrison asked, injecting a slight tremor into his voice. One of the men cracked his knuckles theatrically. The leader's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Let's just say the insurance rates for farms in this area have gone up recently. Accidents happen, fires start, animals disappear." Harrison nodded slowly, appearing to process this information. His slight stoop became more pronounced, suggesting resignation. The leader's posture relaxed slightly, exactly as intended. "I'll need time to think about it," Harrison said, his voice wavering. "You have until tomorrow night," the leader replied. "We'll return for your answer then." He turned to leave, but paused. "Oh, and don't bother calling the sheriff. He's been quite cooperative in minding his own business." As they filed out of the barn, Harrison maintained his defeated posture. Only after their vehicles had disappeared down his driveway did he straighten up, his movements becoming fluid and precise as he secured the barn doors. He conducted a thorough sweep of his property, noting signs of their surveillance. They'd examined his fence lines, tested his security cameras, which they thought they'd discovered all of, and left subtle markers for their return visit. Inside his house, Harrison activated a series of hidden monitors. The broken security camera they'd spotted had captured clear images of their faces. Their overconfidence had made them sloppy. None had bothered to wear masks. He watched their vehicle's dust trail disappear down the road through his specially modified window glass. They'd return tomorrow, expecting to find a frightened old man ready to surrender his property. Instead, they'd encounter their first real resistance in Miller's Creek. Harrison allowed himself a small smile as he began his preparations. They'd chosen his farm as their next target, believing him to be the weakest link in the area. Their mistake wasn't in choosing his property. It was in assuming they'd be the ones setting the trap. As night fell over the farm, Harrison methodically checked his security measures. The barn they'd so carelessly invaded was more fortress than storage space, though none of its defensive features were visible to the untrained eye. Tomorrow, they would learn the difference between an easy target and a carefully prepared position. The quiet darkness settled over the farm like a blanket, broken only by the distant sound of crickets. To any observer, the property appeared peaceful, its owner presumably cowering inside, dreading the gang's return. But in the shadows of his home, Harrison began implementing the first phase of a plan 20 years of experience had taught him to execute perfectly. At precisely 2300 hours, Harrison descended into his basement, moving past preserved vegetables and farming equipment to a hidden panel behind an old shelf. His fingers found the biometric scanner disguised as a rusty pipe fitting. The false wall slid open silently, revealing a small communication center. The equipment, though dated, remained meticulously maintained. Harrison powered up a secure satellite phone, one of the few connections to his past life he'd kept operational. He dialed a number from memory, one that hadn't changed in 20 years. 3 rings, then a click. "Murphy's Auto Parts," a gruff voice answered. "I need parts for a '67 Corvette," Harrison said, reciting the decades-old recognition code. "Red, preferably." A pause. "James?" The voice lost its commercial pretense. "Jesus Christ, it's been years." "Hello, Marcus." Harrison allowed himself a small smile. Marcus Chen had been his support operator for 15 years, the voice in his ear during countless operations. "I'm calling in that favor from Belgrade." The line went silent for a moment. Belgrade had been their last mission together, the one that had convinced Harrison to retire. "Must be serious if you're breaking radio silence after all this time." Harrison outlined the situation efficiently, using their old shorthand. Marcus listened without interruption, though Harrison could hear him typing rapidly in the background. "Local organized crime moving into position. Multiple hostiles. Civilian population at risk. Compromised law enforcement." Marcus summarized. "Just like old times, eh?" "I need equipment, Marcus. Clean, untraceable, and information on a group using a black scorpion as their calling card." More typing. "The Scorpion Syndicate. They've been expanding operations across rural areas, using small towns as distribution hubs. Smart strategy, minimal law enforcement. Lots of transit options." A pause. "You sure you want to get involved? You're not exactly in the business anymore." Harrison watched his security monitors, showing the peaceful night outside. "They chose my territory, Marcus. They just don't know it yet. Give me 6 hours. I'll have what you need." Marcus's voice turned serious. "But James, these guys aren't amateurs. They've got connections in high places." "Neither am I." Harrison's response was quiet but firm. "The usual dead drop? Already coordinating. And James, be careful. Retirement doesn't come with medical benefits." The call ended, and Harrison began preparing for the delivery. The old drainage tunnel 3 miles from his property had served as a dead drop during his active years. Its location, seemingly random, had been carefully chosen for its discrete access points and multiple escape routes. While waiting, Harrison accessed a hidden compartment in his barn wall, revealing a cache of basic equipment he'd maintained over the years. The items inside weren't enough for what he faced, but they'd help him hold position until Marcus's delivery arrived. He methodically checked each piece: tactical vest, still serviceable; night vision monocular; batteries replaced regularly; basic medical supplies; and a few other tools of his former trade. Each item carried memories of past operations, missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and failure. His phone vibrated, a text from an encrypted number: "Package en route, sunrise delivery, additional intel attached." Harrison downloaded the encrypted files Marcus had sent. The Scorpion Syndicate was larger than he'd initially estimated, with operations spreading across 3 states. Miller's Creek was just their latest expansion, part of a larger strategy to establish a rural distribution network. The intel included profiles of known members, their tactics, and previous operations. They were professional, well-funded, and had a reputation for brutal efficiency. But they'd never encountered someone like Harrison, someone trained to turn seemingly innocent farming equipment and rural infrastructure into tactical advantages. As he studied the files, Harrison felt old instincts awakening. The quiet farmer persona he'd cultivated began to fade, replaced by the methodical precision of his CIA years. Every piece of information became a tactical consideration, every detail a potential advantage or vulnerability. Dawn was approaching, and with it, Marcus's delivery. Harrison closed down his communication center and returned to his regular routine. To any observer, he would appear to be starting his day like any other farmer, checking his fields, tending to equipment. But beneath this ordinary surface, plans were taking shape. The Scorpion Syndicate thought they were dealing with a simple farmer. By tomorrow night, they'd realize their mistake. The drainage tunnel delivery yielded exactly what Harrison needed. Marcus hadn't lost his touch. The equipment was state-of-the-art, untraceable, and perfectly suited for the situation. Harrison methodically unpacked each item, his mind already formulating tactical applications. He began with the barn, their expected point of return. The large space became a carefully orchestrated maze of advantages. Harrison installed motion sensors disguised as ordinary power outlets, their signals feeding to a concealed tablet. Infrared cameras, masked as ventilation holes, provided comprehensive coverage of every approach angle. The hay bales were strategically repositioned, creating natural choke points while appearing randomly placed. He threaded nearly invisible tripwires across selected pathways, not to trap, but to channel movement in predictable directions. Each rope, tool, and piece of farm equipment was evaluated for its tactical potential and positioned accordingly. "Time to wake up old friends," Harrison muttered, accessing a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside lay specialized equipment from his CIA days, items that had been too valuable to surrender upon retirement. He integrated them seamlessly with Marcus's new supplies, creating redundant systems that appeared to be ordinary farm infrastructure. The barn's lighting system was modified to allow for instant darkness or strategic illumination. Shadows became weapons, angles of approach became killing zones, though Harrison hoped it wouldn't come to that. His goal wasn't to eliminate the threat, but to convince them to withdraw permanently. Outside, he prepared the grounds with the same methodical precision. The gravel driveway was subtly altered to channel vehicles toward specific positions. Security lights were adjusted to create blind spots exactly where he wanted them. Every approach to the barn was mapped and prepared, with multiple contingencies for different scenarios. Harrison's farming equipment became tactical assets. The tractor, positioned haphazardly near the barn, provided both cover and a potential blockade. Agricultural chemicals, safely stored according to regulations, could become smokescreens if necessary. Even the irrigation system could be repurposed to create muddy terrain, limiting vehicle mobility. By mid-afternoon, Harrison had transformed his property into a sophisticated defensive position, while maintaining its appearance as a typical farm. He walked the perimeter one final time, viewing it through his opponent's eyes. They would see the same vulnerable target they'd assessed before, an isolated property with minimal security, managed by an aging farmer. Inside his house, Harrison prepared his final contingencies. Escape routes were verified, emergency supplies checked. He established a secure line to Marcus, who would monitor the situation remotely through the newly installed surveillance system. If things went catastrophically wrong, a single signal would bring additional support, though Harrison preferred to handle this locally. "Testing feed," Marcus's voice came through Harrison's concealed earpiece. "Getting clear visuals from all sectors." "Confirmed," Harrison replied softly, watching the security feeds. The system showed thermal images, motion detection, and standard video, all disguised as normal farm equipment or infrastructure. "Any movement on their end?" "They're staging at the abandoned Miller property 3 miles east. Satellite shows 8 vehicles, estimate 12 to 15 personnel." Harrison nodded, more than expected, but manageable. "They're taking this seriously. Want me to alert any friendly assets in the area?" "Negative. This ends here, quietly." Harrison checked his watch. Sunset in 2 hours. They'd likely move in under cover of darkness, believing it gave them an advantage. He made one final inspection of his preparations. The barn's interior remained familiar enough to avoid raising suspicion during their initial entry, but every aspect had been optimized for his purposes. The tools they'd seen during their first visit remained in place, now supplemented by hidden equipment that would give him complete control of the environment. Harrison allowed himself a moment of reflection. 20 years ago, he'd chosen this property specifically for its defensive potential, hoping he'd never need to use it. Now, as he prepared to protect not just his farm but the entire community, he felt a familiar calm settling over him, the focused readiness that had kept him alive through countless operations. The sun began its descent, painting the farm in long shadows. Harrison took up his initial position, appearing to any observer as nothing more than a farmer completing his evening routine. But beneath this peaceful scene, a sophisticated trap was set, waiting to be sprung. "Let them come," he whispered to himself, watching the first stars appear above his barn. Everything was ready. The attack began at 22:47, announced by the subtle vibration of Harrison's concealed phone. Through his surveillance system, he watched 8 vehicles approach with their lights off, spreading out to surround his property. Their formation was professional. Clearly, they decided to take no chances with the old farmer. Three-man teams moving to your east and west perimeters, Marcus's voice whispered in his ear. Main force approaching the barn. They've got military-grade equipment, James. Harrison stood in the shadows of his barn's loft, watching through a modified thermal scope. The intruders moved with practiced coordination, but their confidence made them predictable. They'd positioned snipers in exactly the locations he'd prepared for, their chosen vantage points now working against them. The first trap triggered silently. Two men crossing the eastern field stumbled into a patch of deliberately muddied ground, their boots sinking just enough to slow them down. Their curses carried clearly through Harrison's directional microphones. Having trouble with the irrigation system, he whispered, his voice carried by hidden speakers. The men froze, unable to locate the source of the sound. It can be tricky this time of year. The psychological game had begun. Harrison's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, thanks to the carefully positioned audio system. He watched the intruders' heat signatures betray their growing uncertainty. The main force reached the barn, their leader from the previous day at point. "Stop playing games, old man," he shouted. "We know you're in here." Harrison responded by killing all external lights simultaneously. The property plunged into darkness, but only for those without night vision equipment. Through his scope, he watched them cluster closer together, exactly as anticipated. "I warned you about proper ventilation with agricultural chemicals," Harrison's voice echoed, as hidden sprayers released a harmless but disorienting mixture of natural irritants. The team's professional formation began to break down as they coughed and struggled to maintain their positions. Thermal signatures showing confusion in their ranks, Marcus reported. Two teams trying to flank the north side. Harrison triggered his next sequence. The irrigation system activated in targeted zones, turning planned escape routes into muddy obstacles. The sound of running water masked his movement as he changed positions. The leader, showing admirable but misplaced courage, kicked in the barn door. "Find him," he ordered, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. Four men entered, weapons ready, scanning the shadows. Harrison allowed himself a small smile. They were looking for threats at eye level, not understanding that the entire structure had been prepared for this moment. With a single command into his concealed microphone, the barn's interior transformed. Strategic lights blazed to life, deliberately positioned to blind anyone without eye protection. The intruders' night vision equipment became a liability, forcing them to tear off their goggles. In their moment of disorientation, Harrison activated the secondary systems. Hidden panels shifted, the barn's interior seemingly rearranging itself. The men found themselves separated, channeled into individual corridors created by sliding hay bales and equipment. Their tactical formation dissolved into chaos. "What the hell is this place?" one man shouted, his voice betraying panic. Harrison moved silently above them, his years of training evident in every precise movement. He triggered localized smoke releases, further disorienting the intruders while remaining clear-headed thanks to his filtered breathing apparatus. The leader, more experienced than his men, recognized the sophistication of the trap. "Fall back," he ordered. "Everyone out now." But retreat wasn't as simple as they'd anticipated. The gravel driveway, subtly altered earlier, now channeled their vehicles into predetermined positions. Hidden caltrops, deployed remotely, waited to puncture tires if they attempted to flee recklessly. "You have two choices," Harrison's voice resonated through the chaos. "Leave Miller's Creek and never return, or discover exactly what else this simple farm can do." To emphasize his point, he triggered a series of controlled explosions in the field, harmless but spectacular. The message was clear. This was only a fraction of his capabilities. Through his scope, Harrison watched the leader's body language shift from aggression to genuine concern. The man had finally realized they weren't dealing with a helpless farmer, but something far more dangerous. "Time to make a decision," Harrison announced, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of his CIA years. "Your next move determines how this ends." The leader's posture changed suddenly, a shift so subtle only someone with Harrison's training would notice it. He holstered his weapon and stepped into a shaft of moonlight streaming through the barn's roof. "Agent Morrison," he called out, using a name Harrison hadn't heard in 20 years. Or should I say, the famous Ghost of Bogota? Harrison felt his muscles tense. Only a handful of people knew that operational codename, most of them dead or retired. He maintained his position in the shadows, reassessing the situation with new eyes. "Santiago sends his regards," the leader continued, a cruel smile playing across his face. "He never forgot how you dismantled his operation in '98. Spent years trying to find you." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about Miller's Creek. It was personal. Santiago, the Colombian cartel leader whose empire Harrison had destroyed, had apparently trained his son well. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable now that Harrison knew to look for it. "Marcus," Harrison whispered into his comm, "we have a situation." "Already on it," Marcus replied. "Running facial recognition. Confirmed. Diego Santiago, born 1988. He's been rebuilding his father's network for the past decade." Diego spread his arms wide, theatrical in his confidence. "You know what's funny? We weren't even looking for you. Miller's Creek was just another expansion point. Finding you here? That's what my father would call divine providence." Harrison watched Diego's men regroup, their movements now displaying significantly more professional discipline. These weren't just common thugs. They were cartel-trained operators playing a role, just as he had played the simple farmer. "Your father made the same mistake," Harrison finally spoke, his voice echoing from multiple points. "He underestimated his opponent." Diego laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My father didn't have satellite coverage of your property for the past week." He pulled out a tablet, displaying thermal images of Harrison's defensive preparations. "We've been watching you turn this place into a fortress. Impressive work, old man." Harrison's mind raced through scenarios. His preparations were compromised, but Diego didn't know everything. The oldest tricks were sometimes the best ones. "Then you know you can't win this," Harrison replied, simultaneously activating his backup systems through a hidden command panel. "Win? Oh no, Agent Morrison. This isn't about winning." Diego's voice hardened. "This is about legacy. Your generation of CIA operatives thought you could reshape the world. My father's generation of cartels thought they could own it, but my people, we learned from both your mistakes." Harrison detected movement in his peripheral vision, more men entering through concealed positions. They'd studied his property better than he'd anticipated. "Your father was just a drug lord," Harrison said, buying time as he initiated his final contingency plan. "What does that make you?" "Evolution," Diego smiled. "We're not just dealing drugs, Morrison. We're building infrastructure, small towns, farming communities, transportation networks, America's forgotten places where people like you hide." He gestured around the barn. "Places like Miller's Creek." "Marcus," Harrison whispered. "Protocol 0. "Already done," Marcus replied. "Satellite shows multiple federal task force units converging on your location. 5 minutes out." Diego continued, unaware of the approaching forces. "You're going to watch as we take this town apart, piece by piece. Then we'll discuss Bogota in detail." Harrison allowed himself to become visible, standing on the barn's upper level. "You forgot the first rule your father learned, Diego. Always know what game you're really playing." Confusion flickered across Diego's face as distant sirens became audible. Harrison smiled for the first time that night. "You thought you found a retired agent hiding from his past," Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "What you actually found was the bait in a trap 3 years in the making. Welcome to Operation Scorpion's Tail." Diego's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You were never hiding," he whispered. "You were hunting." "Miller's Creek wasn't random," Harrison confirmed. "Every vulnerable farm, every helpless owner, all carefully positioned assets. We've been tracking your organization since you started expanding into rural territories." The sound of helicopters joined the approaching sirens. Diego's men looked to him for orders, their professional demeanor cracking. "Your father failed because he thought too small," Harrison continued, moving down to ground level with fluid grace. "You failed because you thought too big. Some of us never retire, Diego. We just change battlefields." Diego drew his weapon with impressive speed, but Harrison was already moving. 20 years of maintaining his skills under the guise of farm work paid off in a single, explosive moment of action. Before Diego could aim, Harrison had disarmed him with a precision that spoke of countless operations. "The Scorpion Syndicate is finished," Harrison said softly, securing Diego as federal agents breached the perimeter. "And Miller's Creek was never yours to take." The following week, Miller's Creek began to return to normal, though something fundamental had shifted in the small farming community. The locals watched with a mixture of awe and bewilderment as federal agents dismantled the Scorpion Syndicate's network across 3 states, using intelligence gathered from Harrison's operation. At Mike's Diner, the regulars whispered about their mysterious neighbor, piecing together fragments of the truth with wild speculation. The quiet farmer who'd lived among them for 20 years had become something of a legend overnight, though Harrison himself remained as unassuming as ever. "Never judge a book by its cover," old Bill Thompson remarked one morning, watching Harrison inspect his cornfields with the same methodical care he'd always shown. "Makes you wonder about everyone else in town, doesn't it?" The federal task force quietly withdrew, leaving behind a changed landscape. The sheriff's department underwent a thorough restructuring, and several local officials suddenly retired. But beneath these surface changes, a deeper transformation had occurred. The community had learned to look out for itself with newfound vigilance. Harrison continued his farming routine, his cover now both broken and somehow stronger than ever. The locals respected his privacy, understanding that sometimes the best protectors were the ones who appeared most ordinary. His carefully maintained fence lines and meticulously organized barn took on new meaning to those who knew where to look. One evening, as the sun set over his property, Harrison received a message from Marcus. "New activity detected in Tennessee. Similar pattern. Interested?" Harrison stood on his porch, coffee in hand, surveying his domain. The farm had served its purpose as both sanctuary and watchtower, allowing him to protect not just himself, but an entire community. Perhaps there were other small towns out there needing similar protection. "Keep me informed," he replied, a slight smile playing across his weathered face. As darkness settled over Miller's Creek, lights flickered on in scattered farmhouses across the countryside. Each one represented a family sleeping more soundly, knowing that their community was watched over by more than just ordinary farmers. The quiet defender of Miller's Creek returned to his evening routine, his true nature now an open secret that made him paradoxically more invisible than ever. After all, who would expect a known former CIA operative to continue serving as a hidden guardian? Sometimes, Harrison mused, the best place to hide is in plain sight. The story of Harrison teaches us that appearances can be deeply deceiving, and that true strength often lies in patience and strategic thinking rather than brute force. How would you have handled this situation? Would you have revealed your true identity earlier? Or like Harrison, would you have waited for the perfect moment to turn the hunters into the hunted? Sometimes the quietest person in the room might just be the most dangerous one. If this story resonated with you and you want to discover more about the power of strategic thinking and hidden strength, click the video appearing on your screen right now to continue your journey of self-discovery. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to never miss our weekly stories of extraordinary people hiding in ordinary places. Remember, the most powerful moves in life are often the ones nobody sees coming.